Your last real conversation probably ended weeks ago. Not a quick update about work, not a check-in about weekend plans. Said something that surprised you, something that changed the way you were thinking before they finished the sentence. You remember exactly when it was. Most people collect those conversations the way other people collect stamps, precisely carefully, with the full awareness that each one is rarer than the last. You've been in rooms full of people since then, at dinners, in offices, at parties where someone handed you a drink and you smiled and said something that kept things moving, and none of it cost you anything because none of it touched anything real. That gap between the room full of people and the feeling of being alone inside it. Most people assume it is a personality problem, something you could fix if you tried harder. It isn't. The gap has a structure. It was built by something specific. And the same thing that built it is the reason the people who feel it most acutely are usually the last ones anyone would expect. In 1983, developmental psychologist Howard Gardner at Harvard proposed that intelligence wasn't one thing. It was at least 7 distinct capacities operating mostly independently. His framework would reshape how researchers talked about human cognition for 4 decades. What mattered for the loneliness question wasn't the number of categories. It was the implication. People who scored high on verbal linguistic or logical mathematical dimensions were running significantly more internal processing than their peers. More connections made, per M and Newt, more pattern recognition, more background comparison happening beneath the surface of every exchange. That extra processing isn't free. There is a cost paid in real time, in the most ordinary situation imaginable. Someone says something at dinner, a comment about politics, or traffic, or a movie they saw last week. For most people at the table, that comment lands, gets a response, and moves on. For one person at the table, it arrives connected to 6 other things. It contradicts something from 3 years ago. It opens a thread that would take 45 minutes to actually follow, and the dinner will be over in 20. So that person says nothing, or says something safe, or laughs at the right moment, and the gap opens a little wider. This is not a metaphor. In 2000, psychologists Mihaly C.S. Csikszentmihalyi and Reed Larson at the University of Chicago studied solitude in high-ability adolescents using a method where students carried pagers that beeped at random intervals throughout the day. Each time, the students stopped and wrote down what they were doing, who they were with, and how they felt. The high-ability students reported feeling better alone than with peers, and worse in social situations than with peers, at rates that were nearly an exact mirror image of the general population. Mirror image, the researchers weren't claiming these students were antisocial. They were claiming something more specific. The social environment the average adolescent finds stimulating, the high-ability adolescent finds understimulating, and understimulating isn't neutral. It is draining. The assumption most people carry is that solitude costs something, that being alone is a withdrawal from the thing that refuels you. For most people, that is accurate. Social contact is restorative, but there is a population for whom this runs in reverse, for whom ordinary social contact is the draining thing, for whom solitude is where the tank fills back up. And here's where it gets complicated. That reversal creates a self-reinforcing loop. You go to the party because you know you are supposed to. You spend 2 hours performing a version of yourself that is easier to be around. You come home exhausted in a way that has nothing to do with how long you were standing up. You feel better alone, and slowly the radius of your world gets smaller. Not because you stopped wanting connection, because every time you reached for it, it cost more than it gave. Loneliness researchers call what happens inside that loop a calibration failure, the mismatch between the depth of connection a person requires to feel genuinely less alone and the depth that is available in ordinary social life. The calibration problem isn't that high-ability people need more people. It is that they need fewer people who operate at a different register. One conversation that actually goes somewhere is worth 40 that don't, but finding that one conversation requires first surviving the 40. Most people stop at 37. And this is where the loneliness stops being uncomfortable and becomes measurable in the body. Starting in 1988, Psychologist John Casiopo at the University of Chicago began tracing what chronic perceived social isolation does at the cellular level. His finding wasn't simply that loneliness caused depression, though depression was often present. He found that loneliness activates the same neural threat detection systems that respond to physical danger. Cortisol rises, sleep architecture changes, inflammatory markers increase. The body does not distinguish between the loneliness of someone with no one to call and the loneliness of someone with no one to quite reach. Both register as threat. Both trigger the same cascade. So here's the argument that seems to sell everything. These people are lonely because they choose to be. They too selective. They set thresholds no one can actually meet. And then they surprised when no one does. You could close the gap tomorrow if you were willing to want simpler things. That argument deserves to be taken seriously. And it isn't entirely wrong. There is a real phenomenon called intellectual arrogance. There are people who have mistaken the experience of thinking differently for the conclusion that they think better, who use complexity as a defense, who keep conversations at a level where no one can challenge them, and then call the resulting distance evidence of their isolation rather than its cause. That pattern exists. The people inside it bear genuine responsibility for some of what they feel, but it only explains a fraction because the cablogen problem is real even when the arrogance is there. Even in people who are genuinely open. Even in people who are actively moving through social environments where the conversations you want to have are not the conversations that are happening, isn't just pickiness. It is documented. It is consistent. It doesn't dissolve by wanting it to be different. In 2016, researchers Satoshi Kanazawa at the London School of Economics and Norman Lee at Singapore Management University published an analysis of more than 15,000 people examining the relationship between social contact frequency and reported life sastogen. For most people, more frequent interaction with friends correlated with higher reported well-being, more social contact, better life. For people who scored in the highest ranges on cognitive ability, the correlation reversed. More frequent social interaction was associated with lower life satisfaction. Not dramatically lower, consistently, replicably lower. Kanazawa and Lai offered an evolutionary explanation. The environments humans evolved in were small groups of 50 to 150 people who knew each other by name and history. Social contact tied directly to survival. Losing your standing meant losing access to food and protection. But in those same environments, the person who could model the group's thinking from outside it, who could see the pattern no one else had noticed yet, did their highest value work alone before the hunt or after it, when everyone else had gone to sleep. Their contribution required not being in the group. The researchers weren't claiming that high cognitive ability people are evolved to be lonely. They were claiming something narrower. The cognitive architecture that makes complex pattern recognition possible also makes the ordinary social environment harder to sustain, not as punishment. As consequence, none of that makes the loneliness easier to carry, and none of it delivers an exit. There is an expectation that the explanation will arrive with instructions. It doesn't work that way. What the research does suggest is something more specific. The people who escape the loop don't do it by learning to want shallower things. They do it by finding the specific 2 or 3 people, not 20, not 100, with whom the calibration problem temporarily dissolves, where the 45-minute conversation actually takes 45 minutes, and both people are still there at the end, and neither had to perform anything. That is the requirement, not a crowded room, not a better attitude, not more effort at the party. One person operating at a compatible register. It sounds easier than it is. The pool of compatible people exists. It is not large. Finding it requires surviving enough conversations that don't work, which is precisely what the calibration problem makes so costly to do. The loop doesn't break easily, but it breaks. What the research doesn't fully sell is whether chronic loneliness reshapes the cognitive architecture that caused it, whether years of moving through environments that don't quite reach you changes what you are able to receive, even when someone who could reach you finally shows up. Whether the gap left open long enough becomes the shape of the space itself. You remember exactly when your last real conversation ended. You also remember the last time someone said something that surprised you, the last time you were still thinking about it the next morning. The specific weight of that, how long it stayed, that weight isn't a malfunction. It is the whole cost, and the only proof that what you are looking for is real.